When a ruthless gang sets their sights on the wrong black business owner, mistaking his calm demeanor for weakness, they quickly learn he is no ordinary man. Brandon Carter, a former Special Forces operative, isn't just fighting to protect his store. He's about to uncover a hidden truth behind the calculated targeting of black communities. Brandon's neighborhood was a tapestry of history and endurance, its cracked sidewalks and faded storefronts holding stories of struggle and triumph. At the heart of it stood Carter's Market, a cornerstone of the community perched at the corner of Fifth and Maple. Inside, every shelf was meticulously arranged, reflecting Brandon's discipline and the pride he took in his work. Behind the counter, his sharp eyes scanned the security feed, a habit ingrained in him from years of military service. Though his days in the Special Forces were behind him, Brandon's instincts remained as sharp as ever. His store was more than a business. It was a haven for his community. Locals didn't just come for groceries, they came for a sense of safety and belonging in a neighborhood constantly under pressure from encroaching gentrification and dubious developers. Each passing face outside, an elderly man walking with a cane, a young mother corralling her child, or teenagers sharing jokes, reminded Brandon of why he stayed. The familiar chime of the doorbell brought him back to the present. A regular customer entered, nodding a greeting as they headed to the back for milk. Brandon returned the nod with a small smile, but his mind lingered on the unsettling rumors he'd been hearing. Whispers of intimidation, of local business owners being coerced into selling out, hung in the air like an unspoken threat. As the evening wore on and the crowd thinned, Brandon locked the door temporarily to count the register. Outside, just a block away, an old pickup truck idled. Inside, it sat three men whose coarse laughter belied their darker intentions. When Brandon reopened the door, the first man to enter moved with a swagger, his gaze sweeping the shelves with a mix of arrogance and greed. Two others followed close behind, their demeanor thick with menace. Brandon's hand hovered near the counter instinctively, his senses now finely tuned to the brewing storm. The apparent leader, Gary, leaned on the counter, his smirk betraying his intent. "Nice place you've got here," he said, drumming his fingers on the surface. "Real nice. Bet you do good business." Brandon met his gaze calmly, letting the man's words hang in the air before replying evenly, "We get by." Gary's companion, Todd, wandered an aisle, dragging his boots noisily across the floor. He picked up a box of cereal, turned it over absently, then tossed it back onto the shelf with an unnecessary clatter. "Bet business could be better, though," he remarked loudly. "You know, with the right kind of help." Brandon's eyes remained locked on Gary, though his peripheral vision tracked Todd's movements. "We don't need any help," he said simply, his voice unshaken. Gary chuckled and shook his head. "That's the thing about guys like you," he sneered, "always so proud, thinking you can do it all on your own. But let me tell you, old man, pride doesn't come cheap. From where I'm standing, it looks like you can't afford it." "Is that so?" Brandon replied, his tone steady. Near the door, Mike, the lanky third man, snickered nervously. "Man, Gary, this guy's got guts. I'll give him that." Standing there all cool, like we're just shopping for groceries, Gary shot him a look that silenced him, then leaned in closer to Brandon. "We're not asking for much," he said in a low, conspiratorial voice. "Just a small fee to make sure nothing happens to this nice little store of yours." Brandon straightened his posture, his expression hardening. "Nothing's going to happen to my store," he said firmly. Gary's smirk wavered momentarily before he let out a laugh. "You hear that, boys? He thinks he's untouchable." He turned to Todd, now closer to the counter, and gestured toward the shelves. "Why don't you show him what happens to guys who don't want to play ball?" Todd grabbed a jar of sauce and inspected it with mock curiosity. "This stuff's expensive," he mused. "Think it'll break if I drop it?" Brandon's hands curled into fists at his sides, but he forced himself to remain composed. "You can leave now," he said, his voice low and firm. Gary raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "Leave? We just got here. Besides, we're not done talking yet." Todd grinned and hurled the jar onto the floor. It shattered with a deafening crash, red sauce splattering across the tiles. The sound reverberated in the tense silence that followed. Brandon didn't flinch. His unyielding gaze met Gary's as he said sharply, "You're cleaning that up." Todd laughed, his boots crunching over the shards of glass as he stepped forward. "Oh, I don't think so, old man, but you can clean it up. Isn't that your job?" Near the door, Mike shifted uneasily, the tension thick enough to cut. Mike's nervous eyes flicked between his companions and Brandon, his unease clear, despite the tension. "Hey, maybe we should chill out, yeah? This guy doesn't look like he's gonna roll over." "Shut up, Mike," Gary snapped, his voice sharp as a blade. His eyes narrowed, locking onto Brandon. "This guy needs to learn how things work around here. We're doing him a favor, and he's spitting in our faces." Brandon tilted his head slightly, his calm demeanor unshaken despite the escalating hostility. "This isn't how things work around here," he said evenly, "and you're not doing me any favors. All you're doing is making a mess you're going to regret." Gary leaned back, resting his hands on his hips as he let out a humorless laugh. "You hear that? This guy thinks he's got options. Let me tell you something, old man. You don't. Not with us. Not with what's coming." "What's coming?" Brandon asked, his voice sharp with curiosity. A subtle challenge layered beneath the question. Todd stepped closer, crossing his arms as he loomed over the counter. "You'll find out soon enough. Unless, of course, you want to make this easy. Sell the store now. We know people who'd love to take it off your hands." Brandon's gaze shifted from one man to the next, unwavering, his presence commanding despite the threat. "I'm not selling. Not today. Not ever." Gary's smirk returned, though frustration now tinged his expression. "You're gonna wish you did," he muttered. "We'll be back, old man. And when we come back, we're not gonna ask nicely." Brandon's voice dropped to a deadly calm, each word cutting through the air like a blade. "You've already made a mistake coming here. If you come back, it'll be your last." The weight of Brandon's words hung heavy in the silence that followed, silencing even Todd's usual bravado. For a brief moment, it seemed Gary might push further, but he reconsidered, motioning to his crew with a curt gesture. "Let's go," Gary barked, his tone short and sharp. The three men moved toward the door, their departure slow and deliberate, each step a challenge. When the bell jingled behind them and the door clicked shut, Brandon allowed himself a deep breath. The storm hadn't struck yet, but he could feel it brewing, dark and inevitable, just beyond the horizon. The next day began like any other. Brandon opened the store early, his routine precise and methodical. But beneath the surface, tension simmered. He had spent the night preparing, not just the store, but himself. Every lock was checked, every security camera angle verified. When he flipped the sign to open, his movements were calm, but his mind remained sharp. He knew they would return. Men like that didn't walk away after being challenged. And he was right. Around midday, the low rumble of an engine echoed down the street, signaling their arrival. Glancing at the security monitor, Brandon saw the familiar battered pickup truck pull up to the curb. Gary stepped out first, his swagger even more exaggerated than before. Todd followed, cracking his knuckles in anticipation, while Mike trailed behind, his smirk cocky yet nervous. The bell above the door chimed, and the atmosphere inside the store shifted instantly. Customers froze mid-step, their eyes darting to the trio. Brandon stepped out from behind the counter, his expression unreadable, but his presence undeniable. "Back so soon?" Brandon asked, his tone even, his words carefully measured. Gary grinned, spreading his arms as he approached the counter. "What can I say? We missed you." Brandon didn't respond, his sharp eyes flicking briefly to Todd, who had already begun wandering the aisles with a mocking air. "We figured you might have had time to reconsider," Gary continued, leaning against the counter. "You know, about our little arrangement." Brandon folded his arms, his stance immovable. "Not interested." Todd let out a sharp laugh, tossing a can of soup into the air and catching it. "That's cute. You think this is a negotiation?" Brandon's gaze shifted briefly to Todd before returning to Gary. "I think it's time for you to leave." Gary's grin faded, replaced by a hard, unforgiving edge. "You've got a smart mouth, old man, but I'm not leaving until you understand how things work around here." With a motion from Gary, Todd swept an entire rack of snacks onto the floor. The clatter of falling bags and boxes startled a few customers, who flinched at the noise. "This store's got some real nice stuff," Todd said, his smirk widening. "Be a shame if anything happened to it." Brandon stepped forward, his voice calm but edged with steel. "Pick it up." Todd raised an eyebrow, feigning amusement. "Or what? Or you'll find out," Brandon replied, his tone razor-sharp. Gary's laughter filled the air, thick with mockery. "Oh, I like this guy. He's got some fire. Too bad it's gonna get him burned." He gestured toward the door, addressing the onlookers. "Customers, get out. Private business meeting happening here." The remaining shoppers hesitated, their nervous glances darting between Brandon and the intruders. Brandon gave them a curt nod, silently urging them to leave. One by one, they shuffled out, casting worried looks over their shoulders. The bell's jingle marked the departure of the last customer, leaving the store cloaked in heavy silence. Gary leaned closer to Brandon, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Now that we've got the place to ourselves, let me make this real simple. You're gonna pay up, or things are gonna get real messy." Todd cracked his knuckles, his grin wide. "Real messy." Brandon didn't flinch. His response came steady and cold. "You're not getting a cent out of me, and if you're smart, you'll walk out that door before this gets worse. For you." Mike let out a derisive snort, leaning against a shelf. "Worse for us? That's rich. You're outnumbered, old man." Gary slammed his hand onto the counter, the impact rattling the cash register. "You think you're tough? You think you're untouchable? You're nothing. Just another punk with a store we're gonna own by the end of the week." Brandon's gaze was as cold as ice. "Try it. See how far you get." The quiet, lethal threat in his voice made even Todd's grin falter, if only for a moment. Gary, however, was undeterred. He turned to Todd and Mike with a sharp nod. "Break something. Let him know we're serious." Without hesitation, Todd grabbed a jar from the shelf and held it high. Mike's hesitant glance flicked nervously between Brandon and his companions, his unease etched clearly on his face. Maybe we should back off," he muttered, his voice shaky. "This guy doesn't look like he's gonna roll over." "Shut up, Mike!" Gary snapped, his tone slicing through the tension like a whip. His narrowing eyes locked on Brandon, his frustration bubbling over. "This guy needs to learn how things work around here. We're doing him a favor, and he's spitting in our faces." Brandon's calm demeanor remained intact as he tilted his head slightly. His voice, steady as a steel blade, cut through the hostility. "This isn't how things work around here, and you're not doing me any favors. All you're doing is creating a mess you're going to regret." Gary leaned back, his hands planted firmly on his hips as he barked a humorless laugh. "You hear that? This guy thinks he's got options. Let me tell you something, old man. You don't. Not with us. Not with what's coming." "What's coming?" Brandon's tone sharpened, curiosity laced with defiance. Todd stepped closer, his arms crossed as his hulking frame loomed over the counter. "You'll find out soon enough, unless you want to make this easy. Sell the store now. We know people who'd love to take it off your hands." Brandon's gaze didn't waver as it swept over the men, his voice unwavering. "I'm not selling. Not today. Not ever." Gary's smirk returned, this time tinged with irritation. "You're gonna wish you did," he growled. "We'll be back, old man. And next time, we're not gonna ask nicely." Brandon's voice dropped into a dangerous calm, each word deliberate and sharp. "You've already made one mistake coming here. If you come back, it'll be your last." The words hung heavily in the air, silencing even Todd's usual bravado. Gary seemed poised to escalate further, but something in Brandon's unyielding presence made him rethink. He jerked his head toward the door, signaling his crew to leave. "Let's go," Gary muttered, his tone clipped with frustration. The three men exited slowly, their deliberate pace daring Brandon to stop them. The bell jingled faintly as the door closed behind them, and the store descended into silence. Brandon exhaled deeply, his mind already calculating what would come next. The storm hadn't struck yet, but its dark clouds loomed ominously on the horizon. The next morning unfolded with routine precision. Brandon opened the store early, his movements methodical as always. Beneath the surface, however, A simmering tension added weight to his every action. He spent the previous night reinforcing his defenses, double-checking locks, repositioning cameras, and mentally preparing for the inevitable. He didn't have to wait long. Around midday, the unmistakable rumble of an engine approached. Brandon glanced at the security monitor, watching the same battered pickup truck pull to the curb. Gary emerged first, his exaggerated swagger telegraphing his intent. Todd followed, cracking his knuckles in anticipation, while Mike trailed behind, a crooked smirk plastered on his face. The bell above the door chimed as they entered, their presence immediately altering the atmosphere. Customers paused mid-step, their conversations halting as they darted wary glances at the intruders. Brandon stepped out from behind the counter, his posture unyielding and his expression unreadable. "Back so soon?" Brandon asked, his tone calm and measured. Gary grinned as he approached the counter, arms outstretched in mock camaraderie. "What can I say? We missed you." Brandon didn't reply, his sharp gaze tracking Todd as he casually wandered the aisles, his actions oozing mockery. Gary leaned on the counter, his grin growing wider. "So, you had time to reconsider, huh? About our little arrangement?" Brandon crossed his arms, his stance resolute. "Not interested," Todd snorted, tossing a can of soup into the air and catching it with theatrical ease. "That's cute. You think this is a negotiation?" Brandon's calm gaze flicked to Todd before returning to Gary. "I think it's time for you to leave." Gary's grin soured, his voice hardening. "You've got a smart mouth, old man, but I'm not leaving until you understand how things work around here." With a casual gesture, Gary signaled to Todd, who swept an entire rack of snacks onto the floor. The crash of falling bags and boxes startled the nearby customers, who flinched at the sound. "This place has some nice stuff," Todd said with a smirk. "Be a shame if something happened to it." Brandon stepped forward, his voice calm but unwavering. "Pick it up." Todd raised an eyebrow, his smirk widening. "Or what? Or you'll find out," Brandon said, his tone sharp and unrelenting. Gary's laughter cut through the tension, thick with derision. "Oh, I like this guy. He's got some fire. Too bad it's gonna get him burned." He gestured toward the door, addressing the onlookers. "All right, folks, time to clear out. Private business meeting happening here." Reluctantly, the customers filed out, their hesitant steps punctuated by the jingling bell. Each glance cast over their shoulders carried a mixture of fear and concern. When the last customer left, Gary turned back to Brandon, his voice dropping into a menacing whisper. "Now that it's just us, here's how this is gonna go. You're gonna pay, or things are gonna get real messy." Todd cracked his knuckles, adding, "Real messy?" Brandon's gaze didn't waver. "You're not getting a cent, and if you're smart, you'll walk out that door while you still can." Mike sneered, leaning casually against a shelf. "Worse for us? That's rich. You're outnumbered, old man." Gary slammed his hand on the counter, his temper flaring. "You think you're tough? You think you're untouchable? You're nothing. Just another punk with a store we're gonna own by the end of the week." Brandon's gaze turned icy. "Try it. See how far you get." The quiet threat in his voice pierced through the bravado, momentarily unsettling Todd. But Gary wasn't backing down. With a sharp nod, he barked an order. "Break something. Show him we're serious." Todd grabbed a jar from the nearest shelf and hurled it to the floor. The glass shattered in a burst of sauce, painting the tiles red. Moments later, chaos erupted as cans, boxes, and entire displays crashed to the ground under Todd and Mike's destructive rampage. Brandon remained rooted, his eyes locked on Gary. When he finally spoke, his voice was razor-sharp. "That's enough." Todd and Mike regrouped behind Gary, their bodies battered and bruised, but their pride and rage kept them upright. The store felt like a pressure cooker, the air thick with unspoken violence and the electric promise of another clash. Gary's voice cut through the tense silence, venom dripping from every word. "You're not going to win this," he growled, his eyes locked on Brandon. "You're just one man. We're going to break you." Brandon stepped forward, his presence filling the space, enough to make even Todd hesitate. His voice was cold, sharp, and unyielding. "You've already lost." The tension in the store reached its peak, A crackling, unbearable weight. Both sides stood frozen, waiting for the other to make the first move. Gary's hand twitched near his side, his smirk now a grimace as frustration began to cloud his bravado. "You've got guts, old man," he sneered. "I'll give you that. But guts won't count for much when you're outnumbered." Todd cracked his knuckles, the sound echoing ominously through the ruined store. His grin was cruel and taunting. "You really should have just handed over the cash. Would have saved yourself a world of hurt." Brandon's gaze never wavered. His voice cut through the room like a blade. "You don't belong here. This is my store, my community. You'll leave, one way or another." Gary's smirk twisted into a snarl, and with no warning, he lunged. Brandon moved, but not quickly enough. Gary's shoulders slammed into his chest, driving him back into the counter with a jarring impact. The breath rushed out of Brandon's lungs, but he didn't falter. Using the counter to steady himself, he retaliated with a sharp elbow to Gary's ribs, forcing the man to stumble back, clutching his side. Todd wasted no time. Seizing the moment to attack, he swung a crowbar he'd grabbed from the floor, the metal cutting through the air. Brandon ducked just in time, the weapon missing his head by inches. But before he could fully recover, Todd's boot connected with his ribs, pain exploding through Brandon's side as he was sent sprawling into a nearby shelf. Mike charged next, wielding a broken piece of shelving like a club. He swung wildly, but Brandon managed to deflect the blow with his forearm, the impact radiating pain up his arm. Brandon gritted his teeth and countered, snatching the makeshift weapon from Mike's grasp and using it to strike him in the shoulder. Mike cried out as he crumpled to the ground, clutching his arm. Gary recovered quickly, his rage boiling over. He launched himself at Brandon, throwing punches in rapid succession. Brandon blocked as many as he could, but one punch caught him square in the jaw, snapping his head to the side. Stars danced in his vision, and he felt the warm trickle of blood at the corner of his lip. "Not so tough now, are you?" Gary sneered, grabbing Brandon by the shirt and slamming him against the wall. Brandon's breaths came in ragged gasps, but he refused to give up. With a sudden burst of strength, he twisted free from Gary's grip and drove his fist into Gary's stomach, doubling him over. But Todd was already back in the fray. The crowbar came swinging toward Brandon's head. He managed to block it with his arm, but the force sent him stumbling again, pain shooting through his already bruised ribs. Todd raised the crowbar for another strike, shouting, "You're going to regret this, old man." Brandon didn't give him the chance. He surged forward, tackling Todd to the ground. The two men wrestled briefly, but Brandon's military training gave him the edge. He wrenched the crowbar from Todd's grip and tossed it across the store before delivering a solid punch that left Todd groaning on the floor. Gary and Mike regrouped, their faces twisted with fury. Gary barked, "Let's finish this!" He grabbed a knife from the floor, flipping it open with a menacing click. Brandon backed toward the counter, his breathing labored but his resolve unbroken. "You want this store?" he said, his voice steady despite the pain. "Come take it!" Gary charged with the knife, but Brandon moved like lightning. He sidestepped the attack, grabbing Gary's wrist mid-swing and slamming it against the counter. The knife clattered to the floor as Brandon drove his knee into Gary's chest, sending him reeling back. Mike hesitated, his confidence shaken. He glanced between Todd, who was still groaning on the ground, and Gary, who struggled to regain his footing. But when Gary shouted, "Get him!" Mike rushed forward. Brandon was ready. He stepped into Mike's charge, using his momentum against him to throw him off balance. With one final shove, Brandon sent Mike crashing into a pile of fallen shelves. The metal groaned under his weight as he collapsed in a heap. Gary, now visibly shaken, stumbled toward the door. His swagger was gone, replaced by pure, unfiltered rage. "You think this is over?" he spat, his voice trembling. "We're not done with you. Not by a long shot." Brandon didn't respond. He stood tall, his stance firm despite the pain radiating through his body. His cold, unyielding gaze followed Gary as he grabbed Todd by the arm and hauled him toward the exit. Mike managed to stagger to his feet, clutching his side as he followed. The three men retreated through the shattered door, their threats echoing faintly in the silence. The roar of their pickup truck's engine broke the stillness as they sped away, leaving a trail of tension in their wake. Brandon remained where he stood, his chest rising and falling with labored breaths. His body screamed in protest, but he refused to show weakness. As the sound of the truck faded, he allowed himself to lean against the counter. The store was a wreck. Broken shelves, scattered goods, and shattered glass littered the floor, but he was still standing. For now, that was enough. The ringing in Brandon's ears had barely faded when the wail of sirens pierced the air outside. Red and blue lights flickered through the shattered windows, casting sharp reflections on the debris-strewn floor. Brandon pushed himself upright, wincing as pain shot through his ribs. His side throbbed with each breath, bruised, maybe worse, and his split lip still dripped blood onto his chin. The bell above the door jingled faintly as the first officer entered, his hand instinctively resting on his holster. His sharp eyes scanned the scene, overturned shelves, shattered jars, and the scattered remains of a once orderly store. Another officer followed close behind, clipboard in hand. Her gaze swept over the chaos before settling on Brandon, who was leaning heavily against the counter. "Sir, are you injured?" she asked, her tone cautious but professional. Brandon wiped his lip with the back of his hand, nodding once. "I'm fine," he replied, though his hoarse voice betrayed his exhaustion. "Fine?" The first officer raised an eyebrow, his voice dripping with skepticism. "This place looks like a war zone. What happened here?" Brandon straightened, ignoring the sharp protest from his ribs. "I was attacked," he said simply. "3 men tried to rob the store. They didn't like the answer I gave them." The female officer glanced at the destruction again, her brow furrowing. "Attacked? And you fought them off?" Brandon met her gaze, his expression steady and firm. "They didn't leave me much of a choice." The first officer stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he looked Brandon up and down. 3 men? And you're saying you took them all on by yourself?" Brandon didn't rise to the bait. "That's exactly what I'm saying." The female officer's tone softened slightly, her questions more measured. "Do you know these men? Have you seen them before?" Brandon hesitated. Gary's sneering remarks echoed in his mind. The veiled racism, the threats against his community. After a moment, he shook his head. "No, but I know their type. They're not here for the money. They're here to intimidate." The first officer frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Brandon leaned more heavily on the counter, his jaw tightening. "They're targeting people like me, black business owners, minorities in this neighborhood. They want to scare us into selling so they can profit off what's left." The officers exchanged a glance. The woman scribbled something onto her clipboard. "That's a serious accusation," she said carefully. "Do you have any evidence to support it?" Brandon gestured broadly to the wreckage around him. "Does this look random to you? They didn't just try to rob me. They wanted to send a message. And it's not the first time I've heard of something like this happening around here." The male officer crossed his arms, his expression skeptical. "And you didn't think to call us before taking matters into your own hands?" Brandon's jaw tightened further, but he kept his tone steady. "I hit the silent alarm as soon as they started making threats. Didn't have time to wait for help." The female officer glanced up at the security cameras mounted in the corners of the store. "Do those work?" "They do," Brandon said. "Footage is backed up automatically. You'll have everything you need to identify them." The male officer walked toward a toppled shelf, crouching to pick up a shattered jar. He muttered, "This kind of damage isn't going to look good for you. Are you sure you didn't escalate things?" Brandon's voice was sharp, his patience thinning. "I defended myself. They came in here looking for trouble, and they found it." The female officer shot her partner a pointed look before turning back to Brandon. "We'll need to review the footage and take your statement. Can you describe the men?" Brandon nodded. 3 of them. The leader, white, mid-40s, about 6 feet tall, with a scar on his cheek. The second guy, stocky, bald, probably in his 30s. And the third, young, tall, lanky, looked nervous. They were driving a beat-up blue pickup truck. The officer jotted everything down, nodding as she wrote. "All right, we'll put out a bulletin and see what we can find. In the meantime, do you need medical attention? You look like you took a pretty bad hit." "I'll be fine," Brandon said curtly, though the ache in his ribs told a different story. The male officer sighed, brushing his hands on his uniform as he straightened. "You're lucky you didn't end up worse off. Next time, maybe leave it to us." Brandon's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't respond. There was no point in explaining himself to someone who didn't understand what it meant to defend something beyond mere property. The officers turned toward the door. The female officer paused, glancing back. "We'll be in touch after we review the footage. If you think of anything else, call us." Brandon nodded, his gaze steady as they stepped outside and began talking near their squad car. The store fell quiet again. The only sounds the faint hum of the lights and the distant wail of another siren. He surveyed the wreckage around him. Every breath sent sharp pain through his side, threatening to overwhelm him. But Brandon pushed the exhaustion aside. There was too much at stake. After locking the front door, he sat heavily behind the counter, his mind racing. Gary's words replayed in his head. The insults, the threats, the sick justification for their actions. This wasn't random. They were targeting him and others in the neighborhood for a reason. Brandon gingerly touched his ribs, wincing as he shifted. The injuries would slow him, but they wouldn't stop him. He leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the grainy security camera feed. This fight wasn't over. Not for him. Not for his community. The image of Gary and his crew striding arrogantly into his store looped endlessly on the grainy security feed. Their smug confidence and aggression burned into Brandon's memory. He rewound the footage again, pausing on the moment their battered blue pickup truck pulled up. It didn't blend into the neighborhood. Too conspicuous. Zooming in, Brandon caught part of the license plate. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Grabbing his phone, he scrolled to a contact. Marcus, an old army buddy turned cybersecurity expert. Marcus answered on the third ring, his voice as sharp and professional as ever. "Brandon, been a while. What's going on?" "I need a favor," Brandon said, his tone clipped. "Some guys hit my store. They're part of something bigger, targeting businesses like mine. I've got a partial plate number. Can you run it?" There was a pause on the other end. "You're not planning on handling this yourself, are you?" Marcus asked, suspicion laced in his voice. Brandon didn't answer directly. "I just need to know who they are." Marcus sighed, but the sound of keystrokes soon followed. "All right, give me the numbers." Brandon rattled off what he could make out from the footage. A few moments later, Marcus let out a sharp exhale. "Got it. The truck's registered to a Todd Andrews. He's got a record. Breaking and entering, aggravated assault, minor drug charges. Address is in the next neighborhood over." Brandon jotted the information down in a notebook. "Appreciate it. You sure you don't want to loop in the cops?" Marcus pressed. "They're already involved," Brandon replied, which wasn't entirely untrue. "But I'm not waiting for them to do their job." Marcus grunted. "Be careful, man. You're not in the field anymore." "Thanks for the concern," Brandon said, ending the call. He stared at the address in his notebook, weighing his options. Charging in blind wasn't an option. He needed to be prepared. In the back room of the store, Brandon unlocked a small safe. Inside were tools he'd hoped never to use again. A tactical flashlight, a collapsible baton, and a sturdy pair of gloves. His movements were deliberate as he strapped them on, ignoring the ache in his ribs. By the time he stepped out of the store, the sun was dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows across the street. Brandon locked the door behind him, climbed into his car, and drove with purpose. The familiar streets of his neighborhood blurred past as his mind stayed fixed on the task ahead. The address Marcus had provided led to a rundown warehouse on the outskirts of the next neighborhood. A chain-link fence surrounded the lot, its gate hanging loosely on rusted hinges. Brandon parked a block away, slipping out of the car and approaching silently on foot, his steps barely audible on the gravel. The warehouse was dimly lit, a single bulb above the entrance casting a faint glow over the cracked pavement. Brandon crouched behind a stack of old pallets, his sharp eyes observing the scene. Two men, Todd and Mike, stood near the entrance, smoking and laughing, their voices carrying through the still night air. "You see the look on that guy's face?" Todd said with a grin, exhaling a plume of smoke. "Thought he was some kind of tough guy." Mike chuckled. "Yeah, well, Gary's gonna make sure he don't think that for long. You hear what he's planning?" "Course I did." Todd snorted. "That old man's not gonna know what hit him. Neither will the rest of these people. They're all gonna fold. One by one, Brandon's jaw tightened. His instincts screamed at him to act, but he forced himself to stay put. He needed more information. "What's the boss saying about the next steps?" Mike asked. Todd shrugged. "Same as always. Intimidate. Wreck some places. Scare them good. Then Harrington's people sweep in and buy it all up. Easy money." Brandon's breath caught. Harrington. The name was a revelation. Vincent Harrington was a notorious developer with a history of gentrifying neighborhoods through underhanded tactics. If he was involved, this wasn't just about Brandon's store. It was a coordinated attack on the entire community. Mike stomped out his cigarette. "You think Gary's coming back for the store tomorrow?" "Hell yeah," Todd replied, his grin widening. "And this time, we'll finish the job." Brandon had heard enough. Slipping back into the shadows, he made his way silently to his car, his mind racing. The fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But now he had a clearer picture of what he was up against. Sitting in his car a block away, Brandon felt the weight of what he'd overheard pressing heavily on his chest. Harrington's involvement was more than a clue. It was the key to understanding the entire scheme. The gang wasn't just a group of violent thugs. They were enforcers, tools in a larger operation designed to displace minority communities and strip them of their homes and livelihoods. The glow of a street lamp illuminated Brandon's notebook as he flipped it open, scribbling down everything he'd learned. Names, locations, tactics. Gary, Todd, and Mike were small players, brutal but disposable. The real mastermind was Harrington. Brandon's mind churned as he stared at the warehouse in the distance. A direct confrontation here wouldn't dismantle the operation. It would only put him in unnecessary danger. To truly stop this, he needed evidence, a plan, and allies. He clenched his fists, his resolve hardening. Harrington's operation wasn't just a threat to his store, it was an attack on the community he'd sworn to protect. As Brandon started his car and drove away, he made a silent vow. Whatever it took, he would stop them. For himself, for his neighbors, and for the future of his neighborhood. The fight had only just begun. Brandon's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. The screen lit up with a message from Detective Maria Alvarez. Reviewed the footage. Sending out an APB on the truck. "Need anything else?" He hesitated for a moment, his fingers hovering over the screen before he typed back. "Can you get me anything on Vincent Harrington? Real estate deals? Business ties? Anything suspicious?" The reply came quickly. "That's a big ask. What are you into, Brandon?" Brandon didn't respond. Instead, he started the car and headed back toward the neighborhood, his mind churning through his next moves. By the time he pulled into the alley behind the store, the streets were quiet, the early morning light casting long shadows across the pavement. Inside, the mess from the night before still greeted him, a stark reminder of the violence that had unfolded. But it wasn't his priority. He locked the front door and retreated to the small office in the back. Under his desk, the safe held more than just emergency supplies. Brandon opened it and retrieved a flash drive, its weight a grim reminder of skills he'd hoped never to use again. Plugging it into his laptop, he launched software designed for reconnaissance and data tracking, tools he'd mastered during his military career. They were meant for war zones, but today they would help uncover the corruption poisoning his community. Brandon worked quickly, the program scanning public records, online databases, and leaked documents. Harrington's name appeared over and over again, tied to suspicious property acquisitions in predominantly minority neighborhoods. Each deal followed a familiar pattern: vandalism, intimidation, and violence, always ending in a suspiciously low sale price. One name stood out repeatedly: Vincent Harrington Development, LLC. The company had recently acquired several properties near Brandon's store. He dug deeper, unearthing emails leaked in a local scandal years earlier. They linked Harrington to known enforcers in other cities, gang leaders who used the same tactics to drive families out of their homes. The pieces were falling into place. Harrington wasn't just gentrifying the neighborhood, he was orchestrating a calculated campaign of fear to force people out. Brandon needed more than circumstantial evidence. He needed a confession, or, better yet, proof that tied Harrington directly to the violence. By the time the sun rose, Brandon had a plan. Gary and his crew were the weak link. They were too arrogant, too careless, and too confident. If provoked the right way, they would let something slip. Brandon would make sure of it. The ache in his ribs protested as he stood, stretching after hours hunched over the laptop. He gathered his notes, locked them away, and stepped into the store to start cleaning. The shattered glass and scattered merchandise were stark reminders of the battle ahead. But as he swept the floor, his resolve only grew stronger. The bell above the door jingled, snapping Brandon to attention. He instinctively tensed before recognizing Detective Maria Alvarez as she stepped inside. Her sharp eyes scanned the damage, arms crossed as she took in the scene. "Looks worse in person," she said, her tone clipped. "Good to see you too," Brandon replied, his voice tinged with dry humor. Maria's expression softened slightly. "You shouldn't be doing this alone," she said. "This isn't just some petty crime ring. These guys are connected, powerful people who don't play fair." "I know," Brandon said, meeting her gaze. "That's why I can't back down." Maria sighed, shaking her head. "I looked into Harrington like you asked. He's got layers of protection. Legal, financial, and otherwise. If you're planning to go after him, you'll need more than a hunch." "I'm working on it," Brandon said, gesturing toward the back office. "I've already found enough to link him to property deals tied to violence and intimidation. It's a start." Maria hesitated, her concern evident. "You're going to get yourself hurt, Brandon. These people don't leave loose ends." "Neither do I," he said, his voice steady. "But I play to win." Maria exhaled sharply. "Fine, I'll keep digging. But if you cross a line, don't expect me to cover for you. I wouldn't ask you to." With that, Maria left, leaving Brandon alone again in the quiet store. He locked the door behind her and began preparing for Gary's inevitable return. This wasn't just about his store anymore. It was about protecting his neighbors, his community, and everything they'd built. By midday, Brandon's plan was in motion. He had spent the morning cleaning just enough to make the store appear open for business. The security cameras were positioned to capture every angle, and a recording device sat under the counter, ready to document everything. Outside, an unmarked police car idled a few blocks away, its occupants waiting for Brandon's signal. Brandon tested the silent alarm again, ensuring it would alert the officers without triggering a loud, obvious chime. If things went as planned, the gang wouldn't know the police were involved until it was too late. The bell above the door jingled around noon. Brandon's muscles tensed as he looked up, but it was only a few regular customers wandering in. He forced himself to relax, greeting them with a nod while keeping one eye on the door. He knew it was only a matter of time before Gary and his crew arrived. When they did, Brandon would be ready. This time, they wouldn't just face him, they'd face the weight of the truth and the consequences that came with it. By 12:30, the store was empty again, the silence thick and oppressive. Brandon stood behind the counter, his hand resting just below it, hovering near the silent alarm. The anticipation gnawed at him, but his exterior remained calm, even as the storm brewed inside. The low growl of an engine soon reached his ears, growing louder as the familiar blue pickup truck rolled into view. Its tires crunched over the pavement, and Brandon's gaze didn't waver as it came to a stop in front of the store. The bell jingled as Gary strode in, flanked by Todd and Mike. Their arrogance filled the room as they surveyed the store, their eyes scanning it like it was already theirs. Gary's smirk widened when his gaze landed on Brandon behind the counter. "Well, well," Gary said, spreading his arms mockingly as he approached. "Look who's still here. I was starting to think you'd finally gotten smart and packed up." Brandon kept his expression neutral, his voice steady. "I told you before, this store isn't going anywhere," Todd snorted, picking up a jar from a nearby shelf and inspecting it with lazy disdain. "You've got guts, old man. I'll give you that. But guts don't mean much when you're outnumbered." Mike leaned against a display rack, his smirk as cocky as ever. "Yeah, and this time, we're not just here to talk." Brandon's hand hovered near the alarm as he watched Gary step closer, his every movement measured and deliberate. "You should have listened," Gary said, his tone dripping with mockery. "Now we've got to make an example out of you." Brandon pressed down on the alarm, activating the silent signal to the officers waiting nearby. He straightened, his demeanor steady and unflinching. "Go ahead," he said. "Let's see how far you get." Gary's smirk faltered for just a moment, replaced by a sneer. "You've got a real mouth on you. You know that." Todd stepped forward, raising the jar as if to throw it, but the faint sound of sirens cut through the air, freezing him in place. The whine grew louder, and Gary turned toward the door, confusion clouding his face. "What the hell?" Gary muttered. Brandon folded his arms. "You didn't think I'd let you keep running this game, did you?" The sirens were deafening now, as two police cars screeched to a stop outside. Officers spilled out, their weapons drawn, barking commands. "Hands up!" one officer shouted. "Get down on the ground, now!" Gary's face twisted with rage as he turned back to Brandon. "You set us up!" Brandon met his glare with an icy calm. "I gave you a chance to walk away. You didn't take it." Todd dropped the jar with a loud crash, raising his hands as two officers entered the store. Mike hesitated, looking to Gary for guidance, but the sight of another officer closing in convinced him to surrender as well. Gary stayed rooted, his fists clenched at his sides as he glared at Brandon. "This isn't over," he growled. "Yes, it is," Brandon replied evenly. The officers moved in, cuffing the three men and reading them their rights. Gary continued to shout threats, but Todd and Mike remained silent, their confidence shattered. As the gang was led outside, Detective Maria Alvarez stepped into the store, her sharp eyes scanning the scene before settling on Brandon. "Nice work," she said, her tone unreadable. Brandon nodded, but kept his gaze fixed on the door, where Gary had just been dragged out. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Harrington was still out there, and Brandon knew the real fight was just beginning. The store felt eerily quiet after the chaos. Brandon sat in the back office, the hum of his laptop the only sound breaking the silence. His ribs ached, his face stung with fresh bruises, but his focus remained sharp. The arrest of Gary and his crew was a small victory, but it was just the first step. Harrington was the true enemy, and the pieces of his operation were finally starting to come into focus. Detective Alvarez had stayed behind after the arrests, poring over the security footage and audio recordings of the confrontation. She now stood in the doorway, her arms crossed and her expression serious. "We've got enough to hold them," Maria said. "Gary's already ranting about how he's just doing a job. He's trying to push the blame up the chain, but he hasn't said Harrington's name yet." Brandon nodded, scrolling through the data he'd compiled on Harrington's shady property acquisitions. "He will. Guys like Gary only stay loyal until the heat gets too high." Maria sighed, pulling out her phone and scrolling through her messages. "We've got patrol units sweeping Harrington's known properties, but he's smart. Everything's tied up in shell corporations and third-party fronts. We'll need something concrete to connect him to this operation." Brandon leaned back, steepling his fingers in thought. Gary and his crew have to be the weak link. They're small-time enforcers, not masterminds. If we apply enough pressure, one of them will crack. Maria raised an eyebrow. "You sound awfully confident for someone who just walked out of a fight with 3 guys. Brandon allowed himself a faint smile. "I've been in worse situations. Besides, this isn't about me. It's about the community. Harrington's been bleeding this neighborhood dry for years, and these thugs are just his tools. If we don't stop him, he'll keep doing it." Maria studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right, I'll push the DA for expedited charges on Gary and his crew. If they see the threat of real prison time, they might start talking." She paused, her gaze shifting to Brandon's bruised face. "You should rest. You're no good to anyone if you burn out." Brandon shook his head, his voice firm. "I'll rest when this is over." Maria sighed, but allowed a faint smile to tug at her lips. "Stubborn as ever. Just be careful, Brandon." As she left, Brandon turned his attention back to his notes and the mounting evidence on Harrington. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt the tide beginning to turn. This wasn't just about his store anymore. It was a fight for the heart of his community. The factory loomed like a specter in the darkness, its broken windows and rusted exterior giving it an air of abandonment. But the faint glow of light from within and the muffled sound of voices told a different story. Brandon parked a few blocks away and approached on foot, his movements silent and deliberate as he slipped into the shadows surrounding the building. The cold night air bit at his skin as he crouched beneath a shattered window. Inside, a group of men stood gathered around a table strewn with papers, cash, and what looked like a blueprint. Brandon's sharp eyes focused on the man at the head of the table, a tall, thin figure whose sharp features were illuminated by the dim light of a flickering bulb. This was the fixer he'd seen in his research, the man Harrington relied on to execute his dirty work. Brandon's gaze shifted to the blueprint at the center of the table. His stomach tightened. It was the unmistakable layout of the community center, a vital cornerstone of the neighborhood. The fixer's cold voice echoed through the factory, each word driving home the stakes of the operation. "Gary's crew made a mess," the fixer said, his tone clipped and businesslike. "But we've got other options. If Carter's Market doesn't fall in line, we'll focus on the community center next. A few well-placed accidents should do the trick." Brandon's fists clenched, his ribs protesting the tension as he reached for his phone. He activated the recording app silently, ensuring every word of this damning conversation was captured. A burly man near the fixer chuckled, cracking his knuckles. "That place is a sitting duck," he said with a sneer. "Half the people who go there can't even afford a lawyer. They'll fold fast once we start breaking things." The fixer smirked, his confidence chilling. "Exactly. Harrington wants this done quickly, so we'll move in tomorrow night. No loose ends." Brandon's jaw tightened as a surge of anger washed over him. These men spoke about destroying lives with the casual indifference of ordering lunch. He stayed rooted to his position, recording every detail of their plan, his resolve hardening with every word. The sound of boots scuffing against the concrete jolted him back to the present. One of the men was pacing toward the window where Brandon was hidden. He pressed himself against the wall, holding his breath as the man's shadow passed mere inches from his position. Inside, the fixer's voice grew sharper, commanding attention. "Harrington's been clear. No more mistakes. I don't care what you have to do. This neighborhood is a gold mine, and we're not letting a few stubborn holdouts get in the way." Brandon moved silently toward another entrance, keeping low and using the cover of shadows and machinery. He needed more than just audio. He needed to see those documents on the table. The back door was unlocked, its rusted hinges creaking softly as Brandon eased it open. He slipped inside, swallowed by the factory's darkness. The hum of conversation continued, the men oblivious to his presence as he crept closer to the table. From behind a stack of pallets, Brandon had a clear view of the blueprints. He scanned the scrawled notes, times, access points, and a chilling phrase written boldly across the top, "Stage fire at community center." Brandon's heart pounded as he memorized every detail. This wasn't just about threats and intimidation. It was a coordinated plan to dismantle the community, piece by piece, for profit. He reached for his phone again, this time activating the camera to capture images of the documents. A sudden burst of laughter from the group covered the faint click of the camera shutter. Brandon moved carefully, inching closer to get a better angle. His ribs ached, but he pushed through the pain. This evidence could be the key to dismantling Harrington's operation and protecting his neighborhood. As he took another photo, the fixer's voice rang out, commanding the room. "This ends tomorrow. Carter's Market, the community center, all of it. By the time we're done, this neighborhood will belong to Harrington." Brandon retreated into the shadows, his breathing steady despite the fire of determination burning within him. He had what he needed, but getting out unnoticed would be just as critical as gathering the evidence. The future of his community depended on it. The fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Brandon's phone camera captured a photo of the documents just as the faint shutter sound echoed in the dim factory. It was barely audible, but enough to catch the attention of one of the men at the table. "What was that?" the man said sharply, his head snapping toward the shadows. Brandon froze, his heart pounding as the fixer raised a hand to silence the murmurs. His sharp, calculating eyes scanned the room. "Check it out," he ordered, his voice cold and commanding. Two of the men began moving toward Brandon's position, their flashlights slicing through the darkness. Brandon slid further into the shadows, his movements deliberate and silent. He needed to stay calm and draw them away from the evidence without revealing himself. The first man rounded the corner of the pallets, his flashlight beam sweeping across the floor. Brandon waited until the man turned slightly, then moved with precision. He grabbed the man's arm, twisted it sharply, and delivered a controlled strike to his side. The man crumpled silently to the ground. The second man turned, his flashlight catching a flicker of movement. "Hey!" he started. But Brandon was already on him. A swift blow to the neck silenced him, and he collapsed into a heap. The faint scuffle was enough to alert the rest of the crew. "We've got company!" the fixer barked, reaching for the gun tucked into his waistband. Brandon darted back into the shadows, his mind racing. The factory was a labyrinth of crates and machinery, but he knew he couldn't rely on hiding forever. He needed to act quickly. Spotting a stack of crates near the table, he made his move. With one hard shove, Brandon sent the stack crashing onto the table. Papers and cash scattered in every direction, and the blueprints crumpled under the weight. "Over there!" one of the men shouted, and the remaining crew charged toward him. Using the chaos to his advantage, Brandon wove through the machinery and crates, leading the men to the far side of the factory. But the fixer didn't follow. Instead, he crouched near the table, frantically gathering what he could. Brandon cursed under his breath. He couldn't let the fixer escape with the blueprints. Just as the man stood, clutching the plans, the piercing sound of sirens cut through the air. Red and blue lights flashed through the factory windows, and the fixer's expression twisted into panic. "Cops!" one of the men shouted. The crew scattered, but the police were already closing in. Officers burst through the front and back entrances, weapons drawn. "Hands in the air!" one officer barked. "Get down on the ground now!" Brandon stepped out from the shadows, raising his hands to show he wasn't a threat. The fixer tried to make a break for it, but two officers tackled him to the ground, the blueprints slipping from his grasp. Detective Maria Alvarez entered moments later, her sharp gaze sweeping over the scene. She locked eyes with Brandon and gave a small nod. "Good work," she said simply. Brandon exhaled deeply, the tension in his shoulders finally easing. The fight wasn't over, but this was a critical step. Harrington's operation was beginning to crumble, and Brandon wasn't about to let up. The cold fluorescent lights of the interrogation room cast harsh shadows across Gary's bruised face. He sat slouched in the chair, his wrists cuffed to the table. A split lip and dark bruise on his cheek gave him a hardened look, but the tension in his posture betrayed his unease. Detective Maria Alvarez placed a thick file on the table with deliberate precision, her expression unreadable. Behind the one-way mirror, Brandon stood watching, his ribs aching, but his resolve unwavering. "He's stubborn," Maria said, glancing back at Brandon through the glass, "but he's not untouchable. You want in on this?" Brandon nodded and stepped into the room. Gary's eyes narrowed as Brandon entered, his posture stiffening. "Well, well," Gary sneered, "if it isn't the tough guy, you come here to gloat?" Brandon sat across from him, his gaze steady. "I came to hear your excuses." Gary leaned back in his chair, forcing a cocky grin despite the tension in his shoulders. "I don't owe you anything." "No," Maria interjected, folding her arms as she stood beside the table. "But you owe us. You're facing a long list of charges. Assault, conspiracy, extortion. Your crew's already talking. Waller, too. It's only a matter of time before Harrington cuts you loose to save himself." Gary's grin faltered for a moment before he masked it with bravado. "You think I'm scared of you? Of him? Harrington doesn't need to cut me loose. He's untouchable, always has been, always will be." Brandon leaned forward, his voice calm but cutting. "Untouchable, huh? Tell that to Waller. He's already giving us everything we need to take Harrington down. You think you're safe? You're a pawn in Harrington's game. Expendable." Gary's smirk disappeared entirely, replaced by a hard glare. "Waller's full of it. He doesn't know anything." Maria opened the file and slid a photo of the community center blueprint across the table. "Really? Because this says otherwise." We've got recordings, documents, and statements tying you directly to Harrington's operations. The only thing we don't have is your side of the story. This is your one chance to get ahead of this before you're buried under the fallout. Pete, Gary stared at the photo, his jaw tightening. You think you can scare me? He muttered. I've been through worse than this. Brandon's voice was quiet, but firm. Worse than prison, because that's where you're headed. And it won't just be you. Harrington won't hesitate to throw you under the bus if it means saving himself. Gary's fists clenched, the cuffs rattling against the table. You don't know him. You don't know what he's capable of. Maria leaned closer, her tone sharp. Then tell us. Show us you're smarter than him. Because right now, all we see is a guy who got caught doing someone else's dirty work. Gary hesitated, his gaze shifting between the photo and Brandon. The weight of his situation was sinking in, and the cracks in his defiance were beginning to show. What's in it for me? He asked finally, his voice low. Maria straightened, her tone matter-of-fact. Cooperate, and we push for reduced charges. Keep stonewalling, and you take the full weight of this on your own. Gary's silence stretched for a moment before he exhaled sharply, his resolve wavering. Fine, I'll talk, but I want guarantees. Maria exchanged a glance with Brandon. The walls were finally closing in on Harrington. Harrington's composure slipped further as the cold steel of the handcuffs snapped around his wrists. His piercing glare was fixed on Brandon, the mask of control he'd worn for so long cracking under the weight of the moment. This isn't over, Harrington growled, his tone laced with venom. Brandon stepped closer, his presence unyielding, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. It is for you, the lives you've destroyed, the communities you've gutted. They'll rebuild, but you won't be there to profit from it anymore. Harrington sneered, his arrogance flickering like a dying ember. You think you've won? You've taken me down, but I'm just one man. There are others out there, bigger than me. You're fighting a losing battle. Maria stepped forward, her sharp eyes locked on Harrington. Then we'll take them down too, starting with you. Every deal, every dime, every connection. You've left a trail, and we'll follow it. For the first time, real fear flashed in Harrington's eyes. He turned his head toward the towering windows of his office, the city sprawling below, the same city he had exploited for years. Now, it stood as a testament to his greed and the pain he had caused. Take him away, Maria ordered. The officers hauled Harrington toward the elevator, his protests growing louder as they descended. The echo of his defiance faded into silence, leaving Maria and Brandon alone in the office. Brandon turned to face the view, his expression thoughtful, yet heavy. The weight of the battle still pressed on his shoulders. The arrest of Harrington was a critical victory, but it was just the beginning of a much larger fight. Maria walked over, standing beside him. You did good, Brandon. Better than most people in your situation would have. He exhaled deeply, his fists unclenching at last. It's not about me, it's about them. The families, the businesses, the kids who deserve a place to feel safe. Harrington's gone, but the damage he did, that'll take time to fix. Maria nodded, her voice steady. And you'll be part of that fix. You've already started. Brandon turned to her, a flicker of determination returning to his gaze. This isn't over for me either. Harrington may be in cuffs, but there's more out there, more people like him, more schemes waiting to be uncovered. I can't let this end here. Maria placed a hand on his shoulder. You won't have to. People like Harrington rely on fear and silence, but you've shown what happens when someone decides to fight back. That's what they're afraid of. The two stood in silence for a moment, the sun dipping below the horizon and casting a golden glow over the city. It was a new beginning, one shaped by resilience and justice. Brandon turned away from the view, his resolve solidified. This neighborhood has been through hell, but it's still standing. And so am I. Maria smirked faintly. That's what scares them the most. As the two walked out of the office and into the night, the city seemed to hum with quiet hope. The battle against Harrington was over, but the fight for the soul of the community had just begun. And this time, Brandon knew they were ready. Brandon adjusted his tie one last time, staring at his reflection in the mirror. The lines on his face seemed deeper, etched by the weeks of relentless battles, physical, emotional, and legal. But there was also a strength in his eyes, a resolve that hadn't wavered despite the toll. Today wasn't just about his store or even his neighborhood. It was about standing up to the greed and cruelty that had torn so many lives apart. The morning air was crisp as he stepped out of his apartment. The streets were unusually quiet, the weight of the day hanging heavy in the atmosphere. Brandon locked the door behind him and walked toward the courthouse, his steps steady and deliberate. He didn't have to make the journey alone. By the time he reached the corner, familiar faces began to appear. Neighbors, friends, even customers he hadn't seen in years. They joined him silently, walking beside him in a show of solidarity. By the time Brandon reached the courthouse steps, a small crowd had gathered. They offered him quiet nods, murmurs of encouragement, and hands on his shoulders. Among them was Mrs. Jenkins, clutching a scarf against the cold, her eyes brimming with pride. "We're with you, Brandon," she said softly. "All of us." Brandon nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "Thank you." Inside, the courthouse buzzed with anticipation. The trial of Vincent Harrington had drawn media attention. Reporters and cameras lined up in the hallways. Brandon ignored them, his focus solely on the task ahead. Maria was waiting near the courtroom doors, a warm coffee in hand and a reassuring smile on her face. "Ready?" she asked. "As I'll ever be," Brandon replied, taking the coffee gratefully. Maria led him inside, where the courtroom was already filling with people. The prosecution team sat at one table, their meticulous preparation evident in the neat stacks of documents and exhibits. Across the aisle, Harrington sat with his team of high-priced lawyers. His suit was immaculate, his expression calm. But there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something less confident than the man who had smirked at Brandon during his arrest. Evelyn Cho, the lead prosecutor, leaned toward Brandon as he took his seat beside her. "Just remember," she said in a low voice, "speak the truth. The jury needs to see the person behind all this. You're the heart of this case." Brandon nodded, his hands resting on the table to steady himself. The judge entered, and the courtroom rose in unison. As the trial began, Brandon listened intently as the prosecution laid out their case. They presented evidence methodically: Gary's testimony, Waller's confession, the blueprints from the factory, and the surveillance footage from the store. Each piece chipped away at Harrington's facade of untouchability. When it was Brandon's turn to take the stand, the weight of the moment pressed down on him. He adjusted his tie again as he approached the witness box, his heart pounding. As he took the oath, he glanced at Maria in the gallery. She gave him a subtle nod, her confidence in him unwavering. Evelyn's questions were direct but empathetic, guiding Brandon through his story. He spoke about the store, the community it served, and what it meant to him and his neighbors. He described the intimidation he had faced, the attacks on his livelihood, and the devastation he'd uncovered in Harrington's wake. His voice remained steady, but the emotion behind his words was palpable. "They didn't just target my store," Brandon said, his gaze sweeping the jury. "They targeted my community. They wanted to erase us, to take what we built, and turn it into something we couldn't even recognize. This isn't just about money. It's about people, families, and the lives they've destroyed." The defense tried to rattle him, painting him as overly emotional and exaggerating his claims. But Brandon didn't falter. He answered each question calmly, his truth unshakable. When the cross-examination ended, he stepped down from the stand, his shoulders lighter despite the intensity of the moment. The trial stretched on for days, each witness and piece of evidence building the case against Harrington. The prosecution's strategy was airtight, and by the time closing arguments began, the cracks in Harrington's defense were glaring. Evelyn Cho delivered a powerful final statement, her words cutting to the core of Harrington's greed and manipulation. When the jury left to deliberate, the courtroom fell into a tense silence. Brandon sat with Maria in the hallway, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "You did everything you could," Maria said, her tone gentle but firm. Brandon nodded, exhaling slowly. "Now we wait." Hours passed before the jury returned. The courtroom filled with hushed whispers as the foreperson stood to deliver the verdict. Brandon's heart raced as the words echoed through the room. "Guilty on all counts." A collective sigh of relief swept through the room. Harrington's expression hardened, his confidence shattered, as the weight of the conviction settled in. Brandon felt a wave of emotion crash over him. Relief, exhaustion, and a deep sense of justice. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted in cheers as the news spread. Brandon stepped into the cold afternoon air, the sun breaking through the clouds as if to mark the moment. Maria stood beside him, her expression triumphant. "You did it," she said. "We did it," Brandon replied, a small smile breaking through his usual stoicism. As the crowd surrounded him, offering handshakes and words of gratitude, Brandon felt something he hadn't in a long time: hope. The fight had been long and grueling, but the victory was real. And while there was still work to be done, for the first time, Brandon believed the community could heal and rebuild together. Evelyn Cho's voice rang through the courtroom, steady and authoritative. "Your Honor, the prosecution calls Eric Waller to the stand." A murmur rippled through the courtroom as Waller, Harrington's fixer, was escorted in by an officer. His disheveled appearance and downcast gaze were a stark contrast to the confident demeanor he'd likely once carried while carrying out Harrington's schemes. The weight of his betrayal to his former boss hung heavy in the air as he took the stand. Avoiding eye contact with Harrington, who sat stone-faced at the defense table, Waller raised his hand and swore the oath, his voice barely audible. He settled into the chair, glancing nervously at Evelyn as she approached the stand. "Mr. Waller," Evelyn began, her tone measured but firm, "can you describe your role in Vincent Harrington's operation?" Waller shifted uncomfortably, his hands clasped tightly. I was the middleman," he admitted. "Harrington didn't like to get his hands dirty. He had me handle the payments, coordinate with the crews, and deliver instructions to make sure everything went according to plan." "And by everything," Evelyn pressed, "you mean the intimidation and violence used to force property owners to sell?" Waller swallowed hard, nodding reluctantly. "Yes. Harrington wanted results, and he didn't care how we got them. As long as the properties were signed over, he didn't ask questions." Evelyn picked up a file from the prosecution's table, opening it to reveal a set of documents. She displayed one for the court. "These are blueprints recovered from a factory linked to Harrington's operations. Can you confirm their purpose?" Waller's gaze flicked toward the blueprint, and he nodded again. "Their plans," he said quietly, "for targeting specific properties. Harrington wanted to know the layouts so we could plan break-ins, vandalism, or other accidents to scare the owners into selling." "And was the community center among these targets?" Evelyn asked. "Yes," Waller replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Harrington saw it as prime real estate. He had us plan to stage a fire there, make it look like a gas leak. He said the owners wouldn't have the money to rebuild, and they'd have no choice but to sell." A collective gasp echoed through the courtroom. The jury leaned forward, their shock and disgust evident. Evelyn let the silence linger, allowing the weight of Waller's words to settle over the room. "Did Harrington ever express any concern for the people affected by his plans?" Evelyn asked, her voice sharp. Waller shook his head. "No. To him, they were just obstacles. He only cared about the properties and the money he'd make flipping them for his developments." Evelyn stepped closer, her expression unyielding. "And why are you testifying today, Mr. Waller?" Waller hesitated, his hands fidgeting nervously. "Because I can't do this anymore. People got hurt. Families lost everything, and I was part of it. I need to make it right, as much as I can." Evelyn nodded, stepping back. "No further questions, Your Honor." The defense attorney stood, his polished demeanor intact as he approached Waller. "Mr. Waller," he began smoothly, "you've admitted to being an integral part of this operation. Isn't it true that you were acting of your own volition? That Harrington never explicitly ordered you to carry out these crimes?" Waller's gaze hardened slightly. "No, Harrington gave the orders. He just didn't say the words directly, but we all knew what he wanted." The attorney raised an eyebrow, his tone condescending. "So, you're saying you acted on assumptions, not direct instructions?" Waller's voice steadied. "I'm saying Harrington built this operation. Every move we made was because of him. He hid behind people like me to keep his hands clean, but he knew exactly what was happening. The defense attorney smirked, but it lacked conviction. "No further questions," he muttered, retreating to his seat. As Waller stepped down, the courtroom buzzed with tension. Evelyn's case was building momentum, each piece of testimony tightening the noose around Harrington. Brandon watched from his seat beside Evelyn, his fists clenched as he listened. Waller's admission was damning, but it also reaffirmed everything Brandon had fought for. The truth was coming to light, and the community's voice was being heard. Maria leaned over, whispering, "He's cracking." "The jury's seeing it too." Brandon nodded, his gaze fixed on Harrington. The man who had wreaked havoc on his neighborhood now sat visibly shaken, his once impenetrable confidence faltering. The trial pressed on, each day bringing more revelations, more evidence, and more weight to the case against Harrington. By the time closing arguments began, the prosecution's narrative was undeniable. Harrington's greed had destroyed lives, and justice demanded accountability. As the jury left to deliberate, Brandon stepped outside into the cool evening air. Maria joined him, her expression a mix of exhaustion and hope. "This is it," she said quietly. Brandon nodded, his voice firm. "For the community, for everyone he hurt." Maria placed a hand on his shoulder, her gaze steady. "You've done more than anyone could have asked, Brandon. No matter what happens, you've already made a difference." They stood together, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon, the courthouse looming behind them. The fight wasn't over yet, but for the first time, Brandon felt the weight begin to lift. Justice was close, and this time it was on their side. The judge's words hung heavy in the courtroom, each syllable driving home the gravity of Vincent Harrington's actions. He sat at the defense table, his once confident demeanor reduced to a hollow mask of defeat. The courtroom remained silent, the tension palpable as the judge delivered the final blow. "Mr. Harrington," the judge continued, his voice measured but firm, "your actions were not just criminal but morally reprehensible. You prioritized profit over people, targeting the most vulnerable among us with calculated malice. This court hereby sentences you to 30 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Your empire of greed ends today." A murmur rippled through the gallery as the sentence was handed down. Brandon sat still, his heart pounding as the weight of the judge's decision settled over the room. Beside him, Maria leaned slightly closer, her voice barely a whisper. "It's done," she said, her tone laced with relief and resolve. Harrington's shoulders sagged further as the guards moved in to escort him away. He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes meeting Brandon's. The fury and arrogance that had once burned brightly were now replaced with a hollow defeat. As the courtroom emptied, the crowd outside erupted in cheers. News cameras flashed, and reporters jostled for space, eager to capture the moment that marked the downfall of one of the city's most notorious figures. Brandon stepped into the crisp evening air, the sounds of celebration echoing down the courthouse steps. Maria walked beside him, her expression soft but proud. "You did it," she said simply. Brandon shook his head, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. "We did it, but this isn't the end. There's still work to do. Rebuilding what he tore down won't be easy." Maria nodded, her voice steady. "No, it won't. But you've already shown this community what it means to stand up and fight back. That's where it starts." The two stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the day slowly giving way to a quiet hope. The fight had been long and grueling, but Harrington's conviction was more than a victory. It was a statement. That night, Brandon returned to his store. The lights were on, the shelves still half empty, and the scars of the struggle evident in the cracks and splinters that hadn't yet been repaired. But the air felt different, lighter. As he stood behind the counter, customers trickled in, offering small smiles, handshakes, and words of encouragement. "We're proud of you," Mrs. Jenkins said, clutching her grocery bag. "You've given us hope again." Brandon nodded, his voice soft but firm. "This isn't just my fight, it's ours, and together we'll rebuild." Later, as the store quieted and the streets outside grew still, Brandon sat alone behind the counter, reflecting on everything that had led to this moment. The community center was safe, The neighborhood had rallied, and Harrington's reign of terror was over. For the first time in what felt like years, Brandon allowed himself to breathe deeply, a flicker of peace settling over him. The battle had been hard fought, but it wasn't just a victory for him. It was a victory for everyone who called this neighborhood home. Together, they would rebuild, stronger than before. The courtroom fell silent as the judge delivered the final sentencing. You are sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole. Additionally, you will pay restitution to the affected businesses and families, totaling $15 million. Harrington's expression hardened, but his composure cracked as bailiffs approached to escort him from the courtroom. He glanced back once, his icy glare landing squarely on Brandon. But Brandon didn't flinch. Justice had been served, and no amount of Harrington's resentment could change that. Eric Waller's sentencing followed. His cooperation had been critical in dismantling Harrington's empire, his testimony shining a light on the web of corruption and violence. However, his role in orchestrating those same crimes couldn't be ignored. Mr. Waller, the judge began, his tone firm but measured, while your cooperation has been noted and appreciated, it does not absolve you of your actions. You were a willing participant in a scheme that caused irreparable harm to innocent people. However, your decision to testify has helped bring the truth to light. The judge paused, letting the gravity of his words settle before continuing. You are sentenced to 7 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 4 years for good behavior. Additionally, you will pay restitution of $500,000 to the victims of your crimes. Waller nodded slowly, his face pale but resigned. He had traded his freedom for a shot at redemption, and the weight of his choices was evident as he was led out of the courtroom. Next came Gary and his crew. The judge's words were laced with disdain as he addressed them. Mr. Gary Campbell, Mr. Todd Andrews, and Mr. Michael Reed. Your actions were not only criminal, but cowardly. You targeted vulnerable business owners and communities, believing you could intimidate them into submission. You physically assaulted a man who stood against you and showed no regard for the lives you disrupted. The judge fixed his gaze on Gary first. Mr. Campbell, as the leader of this crew, you bear the greatest responsibility. You are sentenced to 15 years in prison with no possibility of parole. Gary's bravado had evaporated entirely, his eyes fixed on the floor as the sentence was handed down. The judge turned to Todd. Mr. Andrews, your willingness to participate in these violent acts cannot be overlooked. You are sentenced to 10 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 8 years. Finally, the judge addressed Mike. Mr. Reed, while your role was lesser, you were still complicit in these crimes. You are sentenced to 7 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 5 years. All 3 men were led out of the courtroom in silence, their fates sealed. As the courtroom emptied, Brandon remained seated, letting the weight of the moment sink in. The fight had been long and arduous, but justice had prevailed. Maria joined him, her expression softer than usual. You did it, she said. Brandon shook his head slightly, his gaze fixed on the empty defense table. We did it. It wasn't just about me. It was about everyone who fought back, everyone who didn't let them win. Maria smiled faintly. And now they have a chance to rebuild. In the weeks that followed, Harrington's seized properties were repurposed for the community. Restitution funds flowed to the affected families and businesses, and the neighborhood began to heal. The community center reopened, its programs expanding with the influx of support. Brandon's store became a symbol of resilience. Neighbors came together to help repair the damage, and the once shattered storefront now stood stronger than ever. One evening, as Brandon stood behind the counter, Maria walked in, a rare smile on her face. "Still standing?" she asked, her tone light but genuine. "Always," Brandon replied, a quiet strength in his voice. The neighborhood had faced its darkest trials, but together they had emerged stronger. For the first time in years, Brandon felt a sense of peace and hope for the future. Thank you for joining us for this story. If you enjoyed it, please share it with your friends and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. In the meantime, I've handpicked 2 stories I think you'll enjoy. Have a great day.